almost done. We only have like 5 more class periods together, if you don't count exams. All right. So, like I said last time, I think this chapter is particularly important, and you'll kind of see why on Friday, because I'm going to talk a little bit about the application of some of this information that goes on in everyday medicine. So one of the reasons that I kind of slow down on this chapter and try to go through some of the details is because in this system, the details matter. Because they're used by medications. They are the primary culprits in disease like congestive heart failure, asthma, high blood pressure, even things like diabetes. So there's a lot of clinical relevance that underlies some of this stuff that we're talking about. All right. So to orient us, to put us on the map, the nervous system, like so many other systems that we've encountered, is so complicated that we divide it up into different pieces so that we can make it a little bit more manageable to learn. So the primary division is we have central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. So the CNS, that's just the brain and the spinal cord. Now, this is where all the decisions are made. So all the information processing, or the turning stimuli into response, all takes place in the central system. Now, the peripheral nervous system is everything else. And with the way your book is set up, we don't spend a lot of time on the peripheral nervous system. We talked a bit about some of the major nerves, like the ulnar nerve, radial nerve, femoral nerve, things like that. But the peripheral nervous system, its job is to carry messages to and from the CNS. So we have the afferent division that's bringing in sensory information, and then we have the efferent division that's carrying out motor commands or effector commands. So we divide the peripheral system into the somatic and the autonomic. So the somatic system we've already talked about. We talked about it in that chapter with the spinal cord. So this is the control of voluntary muscle. It's also where all the sensations from the skin come from our various senses of touch, pain, temperature, vibration, those things. The autonomic nervous system, which is what we're going to focus on in this chapter, is all about involuntary functions. The organ systems of the body all have to be able to change according to what the body needs to happen. And you're going to spend the entire next semester in A&P2, you're going to talk about all those things. How the heart changes, the lungs change, the vessels change, the kidneys change, the digestive tract changes. So all of those things have to change. And in order to coordinate that change, we need a nervous system. So that's the autonomic nervous system. It controls the body's involuntary functions. And we divide that autonomic system actually into 3 pieces. Sometimes you'll hear 2 pieces, sometimes you'll hear 3. So I tend to talk about 3. And that's the sympathetic nervous system. This gets the body ready for action. So this is your fight or flight system. It gets the body ready to maximally perform, both intellectually and physically. So it's the attack system or the flee system. And then the other is the opposite of that is the parasympathetic system. This is rest and digest. So this gets the body set up to calm down, to do less, and do things like growth and repair, and digestion. So using the resources that are around to heal the body or sustain it. Now the third one, which isn't on my picture from your book, is the enteric nervous system. And the enteric nervous system controls the digestive tract, which we're going to talk about more in a little while. All right, so we have central versus peripheral, afferent versus efferent. That too is not in here. The afferent nervous system is bringing information in. The efferent nervous system is carrying information out. So we see that as it's another way of describing the peripheral nervous system. And then, like I said, the enteric nervous system, which isn't on there. All right. So if we look at the somatic nervous system, that's voluntary muscle commands, that's sensation from the skin, and we compare it to the autonomic nervous system, we see an important but subtle difference. All right, so in the somatic nervous system, we have an upper motor neuron in the motor cortex, like we talked about in the last chapter. It sends its signal down to the spinal cord, and then a lower motor neuron carries that information out to the skeletal muscle, or whatever the other effector is. So we have a two-neuron chain, upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. We have the same pattern in the sensation side of things. An axon brings information in, synapses, and then another axon sends its information up to the sensory cortex. So a two-neuron chain. In the autonomic system, we have an additional neuron in the chain. So we go from CNS to spinal cord, from spinal cord to ganglia, and then from ganglia out to the affected organs, the effector, whether it's smooth muscle, heart muscle, or glands. So because we have this additional neuron, we have a pre-ganglionic neuron and a post-ganglionic fiber. So a ganglion is just a collection of nerve cell bodies found outside of the central nervous system. So we use it as a kind of marker point. The pre-ganglionic neuron is coming into the ganglia. The post-ganglionic neuron is going out of the ganglia. So some vocabulary that we're going to use frequently in this chapter is this pre-ganglionic versus post-ganglionic fiber. All right. So these ganglia are found in different places depending on if it's the sympathetic division or the parasympathetic division. All right, so we have a pre-ganglionic and a post-ganglionic. Oh, the post-ganglionic fiber is usually myelinated. So that means that it's is usually not myelinated. So it means that the information traveling from the ganglia out to the organ is going to do so rather slowly. Not a problem for the autonomic nervous system, because organs, while they need to change in response to things, they don't have to be as responsive as the skeletal muscles are. Skeletal muscles have to be fast, fast, fast. If we're going to catch a ball, throw a rock, shoot an arrow, that kind of stuff, they got to be quick. For the autonomic system, that speed isn't necessary. So the propagation of information is quite a bit slower. All right. So we have our three divisions: sympathetic, parasympathetic, and enteric. And this system pretty much controls all of the organ systems. So it's going to coordinate cardiovascular response to alter blood pressure according to the body's needs, respiratory response to increase or decrease the amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide traveling in and out of the body. The digestive system, the urinary system, reproductive functions are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. They control things like water, electrolytes, nutrients, gases. So you get the sense that all the physiology that keeps us alive, not necessarily doing anything, that's the skeletal muscles and the brain, but the underlying machine that keeps us alive is really governed by the autonomic nervous system. All right. So it, just like the somatic system, it has receptors and it has effectors. So in various parts of the body, there are specialized receptors called interoreceptors or enteroreceptors that bring information about the body's internal functioning. If the autonomic nervous system is going to coordinate blood pressure, it needs to know what the blood pressure is. And there's a system for that called baroreceptors, which you'll learn more about next semester. All right. So the autonomic nervous system works entirely unconsciously. Now, the conscious mind does affect the autonomic nervous system. For example, if you're watching a scary movie, your heart rate might go up and your blood pressure might go up. That's your conscious mind affecting the autonomic nervous system. But we're not aware of those effects. In other words, we don't hear our autonomic nervous system. It's not part of our conscious awareness. So all of the viscera of the body, viscera is just organs, all the organs of the body have innervation from both divisions. They have a parasympathetic innervation and a sympathetic innervation. So you have these two branches that converge on the same organ. Normally, their effects are opposite. So the parasympathetic division slows a thing down, and the sympathetic division speeds it up. An excellent example of this is the heart rate. The sympathetic division increases the heart rate. The parasympathetic division decreases it. So the heart rate that we have at any given time comes about from the balance of these two forces, so to speak. So even when your heart rate is very high, the parasympathetic division is still participating. It's just the sympathetic division is winning, so to speak. So as one goes up, the other goes down, and whatever the status of an organ is at any given time is the balance between those two things. Because if you took either away, you would have problems. In other words, if you removed the parasympathetic nervous system, things like heart rate and metabolism would be too high. If you took away the sympathetic, things would be too low to sustain life. So we need both sides. We need both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. All right. So as I've already kind of hinted about, there are a lot of medications that use this system or have direct or indirect effects on it. So we learn some of these details, more detail than sometimes we go into on other things. For example, I'm going to want you to know the different receptor types for the sympathetic and parasympathetic. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But why so much detail? Because it's those receptors that a lot of our modern medicines affect. So if you understand the receptor and how it works, you understand how a whole class of medications does what it does. So I'm helping you to learn the pharmacology or the effect of medications. You're going to learn that later. I'm not going to test you on medicines in here. But if you learn this stuff, when you get to that stage, it'll be much easier. You'll just be able to plug it into what you already know. All right. Okay, so those three divisions, sympathetic, parasympathetic, and the ... is the enteric, which we're going to talk about in a minute. All right, so the two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic, arise from different places in the spinal cord or from the CNS. So the sympathetic division, also called fight or flight, we call the thoracolumbar division because it emerges from the spinal cord at the thoracic level and the lumbar level. So from T1 to L2, this is where the sympathetic nervous system emerges from the central nervous system, or the sympathetic division emerges from the central nervous system. The parasympathetic is at the top and bottom, so we call it the craniosacral division because it comes out of the nervous system at the cranial nerves and then down way low in the spinal cord at the sacral nerves. So the thoracolumbar is in the middle, and the craniosacral is at the top and bottom. All right. Now, the enteric nervous system is unique in the body because in many ways the digestive tract has its own nervous system that isn't even connected to the central nervous system. In other words, the digestive tract, there are sensory receptors, there are motor neurons, and there are even interneurons that can process information and control things autonomously. Next semester, when you talk about the digestive tract, you'll see that it's a relatively complicated thing. You know, it represents a significant portion of all of our viscera or all of our organs. And what it does is complicated. You know, we all learn in health class that the small intestine is like 25 feet long, right? Well, that's a lot of smooth muscle to control and coordinate the movement of things in. And the evolution gave the digestive tract its own nervous system to do that. So the brain doesn't have to control that 25 feet of small intestine. It controls itself through its own nervous system. Now, the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions influence the enteric nervous system, but they don't control it. So in some ways, we have two independent nervous systems. We have the one we think of most, the central and peripheral nervous system. And then we also have the enteric system. And where they connect is through the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Now, in this chapter, we're not going to talk much about the enteric nervous system. You're going to get that when you get to the digestive tract next semester. So now, for the rest of our talk today, we're just going to talk about the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. All right. So first up, the sympathetic division in kind of a concept diagram or a box diagram. All right, so it emerges from the CNS at T1 to L2. That's why we call it the thoracolumbar. And those are preganglionic axons that are going to arise from the spinal cord. And they have 3 sites that they're going to head to. Most of them are going to head towards the sympathetic chain. Now, this is a chain of ganglia and nerve connections that sit along the side of the spinal cord. So next to the vertebral column, you have these little bundles of nerves that are called the sympathetic chain. All right. Some of these sympathetic axons, preganglionic axons, are going to go to the collateral ganglia. So these are ganglia that are found in the abdominal cavity up against the posterior wall, and they play an important role in regulating the digestive tract. This is where the reproductive functions are controlled, is through these collateral ganglia. You don't need to know the different ones. I'm not so much interested in you knowing the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system as much as its function. So just know that there's a sympathetic chain, the collateral ganglia. And then the last important part of the sympathetic division is the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands they look a little bit like a pointy hat that sits on top of each kidney. Their new name is actually the suprarenal glands because they sit above the kidneys. And this gland has multiple functions, but its medulla, in other words, its center, is really a giant sympathetic nervous system gland. So we're going to see that the sympathetic nervous system works using epinephrine and norepinephrine as its neurotransmitters. Well, the adrenal medulla it sort of behaves like a giant neuron. You know, neuron, when it receives a signal at its axon, it's going to release neurotransmitter, right? We learned that a couple of weeks ago. Well, the adrenal medulla does just that. It releases neurotransmitter, and a ton of it, only instead of releasing it into a synapse, it releases it into the bloodstream. So this epinephrine and norepinephrine then circulates through the body and affects all of the organs of the body. So the adrenal medulla is thought of as a modified ganglia. You know, a ganglia has cell bodies and axons, right? And at the end of those axons, there's a synapse that releases neurotransmitter. Well, the adrenal medulla, instead of having axons that release neurotransmitter, it just releases neurotransmitter into the bloodstream. You know, and we've all experienced the effect of the adrenal medulla. You know, if you're suddenly startled or something unexpected happens, you get this kind of flood of energy and tension. That's the epinephrine and norepinephrine affecting your muscles, affecting your blood vessels, your heart, your lungs, all of those things to get that fight or flight system up and running. All right, so that's the adrenal. The ganglia, the sympathetic chain and the collateral ganglia, they're more traditional ganglia. So they have axons that go out. That's what these represent, is the axons emerging from these ganglia. And they're going to go out and affect target organs. So the sympathetic chain is going to affect pretty much the diaphragm on up. And then the collateral ganglia is going to affect the diaphragm on down. So one of the characteristics of the sympathetic nervous system is this phrase right here. Short preganglionic fibers, long postganglionic fibers. So what does that mean? Well, the distance from the spinal cord to these ganglia of the sympathetic nervous system is relatively short compared to the distance from the ganglia to the target organ. So the preganglionic fibers, that's these, are short, and the postganglionic fibers, that's these two, are long. And I'll show you a picture here in a minute which will make that a little bit clearer. But this is one of the characteristics, short preganglionic, long postganglionic. Because what we're going to see next is that in the parasympathetic division, it's opposite. These two systems are opposite in a lot of ways, and I want you to know those ways that they're opposite. All right. So looking at the parasympathetic division, So craniosacral, right? We have, it emerges from the CNS in the cranial nerves and then in the sacral nerves at the bottom. So nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10 all carry parasympathetic information. Now 10 is the one that you might as well circle that one because 10 is the vagus nerve and it is the predominant carrier of parasympathetic information in the whole body. These others are more specialized. Here again, I'm not interested in you knowing this anatomy right here. Just know that the parasympathetic preganglionic neurons come out from the cranial and sacral regions, and they go to ganglia that are in or near the target organ. So the sympathetic division, it has ganglia that are very distant, separate from the organs they're going to affect. The parasympathetic, these ganglia are found almost at the site of effect. So like the ciliary ganglion is found very near the eye, and it controls the intrinsic eye muscles, so the pupil and the lens, the muscles that affect those, as we'll learn about later. The pterygopalatine and submandibular ganglia, they're very near the mouth, and they control things like the nasal glands, tear glands, salivary glands. Again, you don't need to know these bolded words, not important. And then vagus nerve 10, it goes out to all the viscera of the body. So the heart, the lungs, the digestive tract, the bladder, the reproductive system. The vagus nerve supplies all of those things. And the ganglia here, they're called intramural. That just means in the wall of. Intramural means in the wall. So an intramural ganglion is literally found inside the organ it's going to affect. So all that to say, for the parasympathetic division, we have long preganglionic fibers and short postganglionic fibers. Why? Because the ganglia for the parasympathetic division are at the organ of effect, as opposed to being close to the spinal cord like the sympathetic division. So we have long preganglionic fibers, that's these orange ones, and short postganglionic fibers, that's these gray ones. All right, so one of the root differences. All right. So here's a more detailed picture. Again, this is not an anatomy drawing. I mean, it is, but I don't expect you to learn all of the names of things here. I want you to look at the pattern. So here's the spinal cord. Here's the sympathetic chain that we talked about, right? And then these guys right here, these are, well, these and these are the collateral ganglia. So the preganglionic fibers are in red, and the ganglionic fibers, or the postganglionic fibers, are in black. So you can see that we have this pattern of short preganglionic fibers and long postganglionic fibers. You see that? And that's because the ganglion here are found very close to the spinal cord from which they emerge. All right? So that's point number one in this picture. Point number two is all of the organs are represented here. So the sympathetic nervous system supplies sympathetic control to all of the different organs. And what we'll see when we look at the parasympathetic is we see all the same organs here, but we see a different pattern before those organs. So in the sympathetic, short preganglionic, long postganglionic. Now the only exception there is this long red one right here, but it's heading to the adrenal gland. And the adrenal gland acts like a ganglion, but it's like a ganglion for the whole body. You know, instead of releasing neurotransmitter at just the site of effect, it's released globally in the body and affects everything. All right. The other thing to see here is that the emergence of this comes from T1 to L2, so the thoracolumbar part of the spinal cord. All right. In our picture of the parasympathetic division, which is this one, we see it's kind of an opposite pattern. Instead of a lot of stuff in the middle and not much at the top and bottom, for the parasympathetic, we have a lot of stuff at the top and bottom and absolutely nothing in the middle. All right? So that's one thing to see. This is craniosacral. The sympathetic is thoracolumbar. Now, the other thing to look at is, again, preganglionic neurons are in red, postganglionic neurons, or ganglionic neurons is another name for them, is in black. So we see long preganglionic fibers going all the way to the organ of effect, and then tiny little short postganglionic fibers. So the ganglia for the parasympathetic division are inside the organs of effect. So we have very short postganglionic fibers, very long preganglionic fibers. And just like in our last picture, we see that all of the different organs are included. So the parasympathetic and the sympathetic innervate the same stuff, but their actions are opposite. You know, the sympathetic is usually speeding things up, and the parasympathetic is usually slowing things down. So, all right. So get your name in if you haven't done that already, very quickly. Okay, I got nothing. Did you get the name question? Yes? Okay. Well, I'm going to end it so we can move on here. Okay. So, which of the organs listed below is not directly innervated by the autonomic nervous system? Oh boy, we're getting a wide range of responses. Go ahead and jump in if you haven't already. Socrativ's been finicky today, so we may have question problems today. Like I couldn't get on their website at all earlier. All right, so I'm going to call it right there. So which of these does not belong is another way you could look at this. Skeletal muscle is controlled by the somatic nervous system. It has no innervation from the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic system can affect skeletal muscle, but not directly. It affects the vessels inside those muscles, not the muscles themselves. But the rest of these, heart, sweat glands, smooth muscles, salivary glands, both have innervation from both sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. All right. Preganglionic fibers from the thoracic and lumbar segments of the spinal cord are part of which division of the autonomic nervous system? Yes. Is it still not?
Yeah.
You may want to log off and log back here. I'm just going to refer to this as we go along here. All right. Okay, so the correct answer here is B, sympathetic. The sympathetic division is also called the thoracolumbar division because it arises from the CNS in the thoracic and lumbar areas of the spinal cord. All right, we're going to skip that one. Okay, so we have, for both systems, for both sympathetic and parasympathetic, we have a preganglionic neuron. That's this first one. So its cell body is in the central nervous system, right? It's in the spinal cord or in the cranial or sacral nerves. So inside the CNS. That sends an axon out to a ganglia, And in these ganglia, we have a bunch of cell bodies. I've just drawn one. And that ganglia, or that cell body, sends its axon from the ganglia out to the effector. So that might be a gland, that might be smooth muscle, that might be an organ, anything that the system is going to affect. So we have our preganglionic neuron, and then this second neuron has more than one name. Sometimes you'll hear it called a postganglionic fiber, which they're talking about this end of it, or a ganglionic neuron if they're talking about the whole thing. All right. So what we're going to see is, so we have two synapses, right? We have one in the ganglia, and then we have one at the end, at the effector. So we're going to see that so we have a neurotransmitter being released from this neuron to affect this neuron, and then we have a neurotransmitter from this neuron to the effector. Now, on both the effector and the neuron, so we have to have a receptor, right? A neurotransmitter doesn't do anything without a receptor. So we're going to see that we have a neurotransmitter and a receptor here, and then we have multiple different kinds of neurotransmitters and receptors at the end here. So we'll start out with the sympathetic division's receptors. Now what we're looking at is we're looking at this. The postganglionic fibers of the sympathetic division release epinephrine or norepinephrine, otherwise called epi, norepi, or just E or NE. Now the older term for this is adrenaline and noradrenaline, because they used to name this based on where it came from, which is the adrenal gland. So adrenaline comes from the adrenal gland. But now we know that epinephrine and norepinephrine are found in a variety of places in the body. So we use their chemical names instead. So epi and norepi. So that's what we're looking here. So in this case, we have NE or E being released. Now on the effector, we can have 5 receptor types. 5 receptor types. So depending on what that effector is going to do, it will have one of these 5 types, all right? So we have alpha receptors and we have beta receptors. The alpha 1 receptor is stimulatory, so it's going to make something happen. So when norepinephrine binds to an alpha 1, it triggers either smooth muscle contraction or secretion. So it makes the effector do something. The alpha 2 receptor is inhibitory, so it slows a thing down. So depending on what the autonomic system is trying to do. So alpha 1s stimulate, alpha 2s inhibit. For the beta receptors, we get a similar pattern. Beta 1s stimulate, beta 2s inhibit. So a mnemonic is the 1s activate and the 2s inhibit. Okay, so help you keep them straight. And then a more recently discovered receptor is the beta 3 receptor. And its effect is more metabolic. It actually triggers the release of fatty acids from adipose tissue. Now, why would the autonomic nervous system do that? Fatty acids are a great energy source for muscle. So when we're in that fight or flee situation, or simply exercising, which the sympathetic nervous system is sort of in charge of, the release of fatty acids by adipose tissue provides energy for the muscle. So it provides the energy to fight or flee. So we have beta 1s, beta 2s, and beta 3s. Now, where do we find beta 1s? We find beta 1s on the heart muscle. And we find beta 2s in the lungs and in the blood vessels. So an old mnemonic is you have 1 heart and 2 lungs, right? So beta 1 is heart, beta 2 is for the lungs. But we see the same pattern. Beta 1s are stimulatory. When beta 1 receptors have epinephrine attached, they speed up the heart rate. So the heart beats faster. The heart also beats stronger in response to beta 1 stimulation. For beta 2, when epinephrine is attached to a beta 2 receptor in the lungs, it causes bronchial dilation. In other words, the tubes that bring air from the mouth down into the lungs, In response to epinephrine and beta-2 receptors, those tubes get bigger. So it means that air can flow more easily into the lungs, and it increases oxygenation, or how much oxygen is coming in. And then beta-3 receptors we've kind of already talked about. The alpha receptors, the classic board question, alpha receptors are found on blood vessels. Alpha-1 receptors are found on vessels all throughout the body. Alpha-2 receptors are only found on vessels in skeletal muscle that supply skeletal muscle. So when alpha-1 receptors are activated, blood vessels get smaller. When blood vessels get smaller, blood pressure goes up. The higher your blood pressure, the more blood there is available to do things, like provide for skeletal muscle. Alpha-2 receptors, when they're stimulated, they cause blood vessels to dilate or get bigger. So in that fight or flight scenario, a mountain lion has just jumped off a cliff and landed right in front of you. What do you need to be able to do? Well, you need to have a high blood pressure so that you can supply oxygen to all your muscles you're going to use to run away. So all the vessels that you don't need to fight the mountain lion get smaller, and the vessels that feed the skeletal muscles get bigger. So essentially, blood is diverted away from the organ systems to the skeletal muscle so that you can run as fast as you can, or you can fight as hard as you can. So alpha receptors are all about blood vessels. Beta receptors have specific organs they're related to. So beta-1 receptor is the heart, beta-2 is the lungs, and then beta-3 is the adipose tissue. All right, so those are the sympathetics. A better name for this slide would be sympathetic postganglionic receptors. So this is the receptor between the ganglionic fiber here and the effector. So these receptors are found on these effectors right here, okay? All right. Because in the parasympathetic, we have a different pattern. All right. So the parasympathetic division uses acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter. Acetylcholine is usually abbreviated ACH, as we've already seen in skeletal muscle. So the very same neurotransmitter that the motor neuron uses to activate skeletal muscle is used by the parasympathetic division at both the ganglia here, so at this synapse, and at this synapse. So we have ACH here, and we have ACH here. All right. Now, something that's interesting is acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter found at all autonomic nervous system ganglia. So the ganglia of both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic both use acetylcholine. So that means that for the sympathetic system, the preganglionic fiber releases acetylcholine, the postganglionic fiber releases epinephrine or norepinephrine, right? We just talked about that. So that's one difference. Acetylcholine at the first one, epi or norepi at the second one. For the parasympathetic division, it's acetylcholine at both. So acetylcholine here and acetylcholine here. So here we only have two different receptor types, not as complicated as the sympathetic. Here, at this neuron, we have nicotinic receptors. And nicotinic receptors are stimulatory. So this neuron releases acetylcholine, binds to a I didn't spell that right, nicotinic receptor, and causes this second neuron to fire. At the effector organ, so here, we have the other receptor type, which is muscarinic. And these receptors get their names based on chemicals found in nature that stimulate them. So the nicotinic receptor, not surprisingly from its name, is stimulated by nicotine, and the muscarinic receptor is stimulated by muscarine. Muscarine is a toxin produced by certain kinds of mushrooms that, when present, will act just like acetylcholine on that receptor. So we have nicotinic receptors. So the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division both have nicotinic receptors in their ganglia, but only the parasympathetic division uses acetylcholine at the end point, and there are muscarinic receptors found at that spot. So we have nicotinic and muscarinic receptors. Do you have a question?
So acetylcholine is found in both the parasympathetic and sympathetic, as well as
At the ganglia.
as well as the nicotinic.
Correct.
Okay.
You got it.
Okay.
Yep. All right. Okay, so that's some details. Okay, quite a few details, I know. But there's some comparison slides coming where I think it'll be maybe a little clearer if it's not. But just some facts about each division. Sympathetic, fight or flight, thoracolumbar. It's active during periods of stress, arousal, exercise, competition, danger, trauma, anger, fear. Anything that would require the best out of you, so to speak, to survive. You know, that's how this system evolved. What does it do? It increases alertness. It increases metabolic rate. Metabolic rate is how quickly your body produces energy from the fuel that's available to it. It increases heart rate, blood pressure, airflow. That's those beta-2 receptors. Dilates the airways and allows more oxygen, more air to flow into the lungs. The sympathetic causes sweat production. Why? Because if you're fighting or fleeing, you're going to have heat to get rid of. And the sweat system is one of our cooling systems. It keeps the body cool. Skeletal muscles get very hot. They produce a lot of heat in their contraction. So this system turns on the radiator, so to speak, in advance so that the muscles can stay cool. And then it also increases blood glucose. Why? Glucose is the easiest fuel for the body's cells to use. So by increasing glucose levels, it provides all the cells of the body what they need to fight or flee. All right. In addition, it reduces fear. This is a central effect. So the adrenaline or the epinephrine and norepinephrine dull some of the judgment centers of the frontal lobe so that we don't experience fear. It also reduces sensitivity to pain. So, you know, if you've ever hurt yourself, you know, after you've been startled or something like that and you don't notice it until later, it's because the sympathetic division turns the pain threshold way up so you don't stop when the mountain lion is attacking you. And then in addition, it reduces digestive and urinary function. If you're fighting a mountain lion, the last thing your body should be doing is digesting or creating urine. Because at that point, that is not what it's concerned about. It's concerned about survival. So we have, in addition to all these stimulatory things, we also have those two reductions. All right. The parasympathetic, very opposite. Rest and digest, craniosacral, predominantly cranial nerves, particularly cranial nerve number 10. And here we have decreases. It decreases metabolic rate, heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate. It constricts the tubes in the lungs to conserve heat and moisture and to reduce metabolic load. And then it very much increases all things secretory or digestive. So it increases blood flow to the GI tract to promote digestion and absorption. It causes an increase in salivary and digestive secretion. You know, we need those secretions to digest our food, and the parasympathetic division is what stimulates those. And then it's active in urination and defecation, too. So there again, these are things that are best done when not in a period of stress or high tension. All right. And then it triggers the storage of nutrients. You know, the sympathetic division triggers the release of nutrients so the body can use them. So we have, again, an opposite. All right. So a quick comparison here at the end of today, and note this note here. Very important slide. This is a summary of a lot of the things we just talked about. So this is a good study slide. If you know everything on this, you're in pretty good shape in terms of the autonomic nervous system. All right, so sympathetic over here, parasympathetic here. We have a preganglionic neuron in both. For the sympathetic division, we have a short preganglionic fiber. For the parasympathetic division, we have a long preganglionic fiber. Here's our ganglion. Now, for the sympathetic, they've divided it. So in the adrenal medulla, the ganglion neuron here releases its neurotransmitter directly into the bloodstream. And in the rest of the ganglia, we have a postganglionic fiber, which is long, and then it releases epi and norepi at the target. So here, at this synapse, this is acetylcholine released from the preganglionic neuron, a nicotinic receptor, right, on the postganglionic or the ganglionic neuron here. All right. For the parasympathetic long preganglionic fiber, this ganglion is going to be found in or near its organ of effect. This synapse right here, acetylcholine, that's the black arrow, so you can see acetylcholine here and here. Same neurotransmitter from the preganglionic neuron. Postganglionic neuron has nicotinic receptors again, so nicotinic receptor here and here. And then the short postganglionic fiber, it releases acetylcholine, and on the target here, you're going to have muscarinic receptors, not nicotinic, but muscarinic. All right. And we talked about some of the locations already. And then the receptor types, this is just an overview. So again, this is more of a study slide for you. I'm not sure if this is from your current book, but I left it in because it's a particularly good table, because it covers the alpha-1, alpha-2, beta-1, beta-2, nicotinic, and muscarinic. The only one that's not there is that beta-3, because it's relatively new. So the 1s stimulate, the 2s inhibit. Alpha receptors are found on vessels. That's where their important function is. Beta-1s are found on the heart primarily, and then these others as well. And then beta-2 receptors are found in the lungs primarily, and they're inhibitory. Nicotinic cholinergic receptors, that just means that they're activated by acetylcholine. We find these at all autonomic ganglion synapses, so both sympathetic and parasympathetic. And then the muscarinic we find only in the parasympathetic effector organs. All right, so let us call it a day there, and we'll get into some application next time. And thank you all for your attention today. I can tell you're paying attention today, so thank you.